I always believed the strangest sound on my family's land would be the wind rolling through waist-high grass, but I was wrong. The morning, everything changed. The air carried the deep, steady growl of an airplane engine, close enough to rattle the windows of my grandfather's old farmhouse before I even stepped onto the porch. I remember the smell of fresh-cut hay mixing with aviation fuel as I looked across my south field and watched a white single-engine airplane descend with absolute confidence, its tires touching down on my pasture as if it had every right in the world to be there. For a few seconds, I honestly wondered if the pilot was making an emergency landing, but there was no panic, no smoke, no wobbling wings. The landing was smooth, practiced, almost routine. The airplane rolled across my field, turned neatly beside a row of painted markers I had never noticed before, and stopped near a windsock fluttering lazily in the Texas breeze. A man climbed out wearing sunglasses and a polo shirt, waved casually toward a black SUV waiting nearby, and smiled at me as though I were the one standing in the wrong place. "Morning," he called. "You're a little early today." I stared at him without answering because I had no idea what he was talking about. Then another SUV appeared from a gravel lane that didn't exist the last time I had visited 6 months earlier. Two more people stepped out carrying duffel bags, chatting about weather conditions and crosswinds like this was the most ordinary airport in America. Nobody asked permission. Nobody apologized. Nobody even looked surprised to see me standing in the middle of my own property. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 39 years old, a civil engineer by trade, and every acre of this land belonged to my family long before luxury subdivisions began spreading across this county. My grandfather bought these 220 acres with money he earned pouring concrete after returning from Korea. He used to tell me that land remembers who respects it. Every fence post, every creek bend, every oak tree had a story attached to it. After he passed away, I kept the property exactly as he wanted. I leased part of it to a neighboring rancher, paid every tax bill on time, and visited whenever work allowed. I never imagined that while I was busy building highways across the state, someone else had quietly built an entirely different kind of road across my pasture. As the pilot climbed back into his airplane and another vehicle pulled up beside him, I noticed tire tracks pressed deep into the grass, bright orange cones stacked near the fence line, and faded white stripes stretching farther across the field than I could see from the porch. Those markings weren't fresh. They had been there for a long time, long enough for the grass to stop fighting them, long enough for people to treat my family's land like a destination instead of private property. The pilot started his engine again, the propeller throwing warm dust into the morning air, and as the aircraft lifted away above my barn, I watched it disappear toward the expensive neighborhood bordering my western fence. That was the exact moment I realized something impossible. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had been operating a private airstrip on my land, and judging by how comfortable everyone looked, they'd been doing it for years without me knowing a thing. The truth is that I almost never spent more than a few weekends each month on the property anymore, and that was exactly why nobody expected me to notice what had happened. My engineering projects kept me traveling across Texas, inspecting bridges, drainage systems, and county highways that stretched hundreds of miles from home. I had built a career solving problems before they became disasters. Yet somehow the biggest problem in my own life had been growing quietly behind my back. Every month, I paid the property taxes automatically. Every spring, I renewed the agricultural lease with my neighbor, Bill Harper, whose cattle grazed the northern pasture. Every fall, I walked the fence lines with a toolbox in one hand and my grandfather's weathered notebook in the other, checking gates, replacing loose wire, and making notes exactly the way he had taught me when I was a kid. He believed land only stayed in your family if you treated it like family. I could still remember the smell of worn leather gloves and fresh cedar posts while he hammered staples into fence rails under the blazing Texas sun. He never rushed. He always said that people who hurried across land usually did not belong there. That memory echoed in my mind as I stood looking across a field that suddenly felt unfamiliar. My grandfather had intentionally left the southern pasture untouched except for seasonal mowing, because he loved watching wildflowers return every spring. Now I noticed long strips where the grass grew shorter than the rest, almost perfectly straight from east to west. The realization settled into my stomach like cold iron. Those were not random tire tracks. They had been maintained. Someone had been cutting that grass with purpose. I climbed into my pickup truck and drove slowly around the edge of the field, rolling down the window as warm air carried the faint smell of fuel that definitely did not belong on a working ranch. Near the tree line, I found something even stranger. Half buried beneath fresh gravel sat a weathered reflector marker identical to the ones I had seen near small rural airports during construction inspections. A few yards away stood a solar-powered light tucked low behind a cluster of mesquite bushes where it could not easily be seen from the county road. None of it made any sense. I had never installed any of it, and neither had my grandfather. Then I looked beyond my western fence toward the upscale neighborhood that had appeared while I was managing projects out of state. Perfect rooftops shimmered in the morning heat. Decorative ponds reflected the sunlight. Golf carts rolled along spotless streets. Everything looked polished, expensive, and carefully controlled. It was called Falcon Ridge Estates, one of those master-planned communities with an active homeowners association that advertised luxury country living only minutes from the city. I remembered receiving a glossy brochure years earlier asking whether I would consider selling my southern acreage for future development. I had thrown it away without a second thought because some things were never for sale. Standing there with dust settling around my boots, I began wondering whether someone in Falcon Ridge had decided my answer simply did not matter. The airplane, the markers, the trimmed runway, and the waiting vehicles suddenly felt connected by an invisible thread, and for the first time since inheriting the ranch, I had the uncomfortable feeling that I knew far less about my own land than the people who had been using it. I decided to start with the simplest question first. Who believed they had the right to use my property? The answer arrived faster than I expected. Around noon, I drove through the stone entrance of Falcon Ridge Estates, where perfectly trimmed hedges lined the boulevard and decorative fountains splashed beside oversized flags. The neighborhood looked like the kind of place where every mailbox matched and every lawn was measured with a ruler. The clubhouse overlooked an artificial lake, and parked beside the entrance sat a polished white luxury sport utility vehicle with a personalized license plate that read FRHOA 1. Inside, the lobby smelled of expensive coffee, fresh paint, and lemon furniture polish. Behind the reception desk, a young assistant smiled politely until I mentioned the airplanes. Her expression changed just enough for me to notice before she disappeared into an office without saying another word. A few moments later, a woman walked out with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her life. Margaret Holloway looked to be in her early 50s, dressed in an immaculate cream blazer despite the Texas heat, carrying a leather folder instead of a purse. Her smile was warm enough to seem welcoming, yet her eyes stayed busy measuring everything about me from my dusty boots to the faded ranch logo on my shirt. She extended her hand as though we had already met. "You must be Mr. Walker," she said. "I was wondering when you would finally stop by." Those words landed harder than I expected. Finally, as if my arrival had been delayed rather than unexpected, I asked a simple question. "Why are airplanes landing on my property?" She did not appear surprised. She did not even deny it. Instead, she gave a patient smile that reminded me of someone explaining obvious facts to a child. "Your South Field has functioned as a community access strip for several years," she replied. "It has been beneficial for local property owners and visiting investors." I blinked, waiting for the part where she admitted there had been a misunderstanding. It never came. She opened the leather folder and slid a colorful community development map across the desk. One corner of my ranch had been shaded in green, with the words Auxiliary Landing Area printed neatly across it. My name was nowhere on the page. "You cannot simply rename someone else's property," I said quietly. Margaret folded her hands. The field appeared abandoned. There were no structures, no regular activity, and no objections. I almost laughed at the logic. By that standard, every empty pasture in Texas would become public property if its owner happened to be busy earning a living somewhere else. She continued speaking in the same calm voice, explaining how the Airstrip improved emergency access, attracted high-value buyers, and increased surrounding home values. Every sentence was carefully polished, as though she had delivered this presentation many times before. The remarkable part was not her confidence. It was how ordinary the entire arrangement seemed to her. She truly believed convenience created permission. Before I left, I noticed a framed aerial photograph hanging beside her office door. Falcon Ridge Estates filled most of the image with elegant homes, curved streets, and sparkling ponds. Along the bottom edge stretched my ranch, and running directly through the center of my southern pasture was a bright white line that looked unmistakably like a runway. The photograph had been professionally printed years earlier. As I walked back into the afternoon heat, the scent of fresh asphalt drifted from a nearby parking lot, and one thought refused to leave my mind. Margaret Holloway had not built this operation overnight. She had spent years making everyone around her believe my land belonged to the neighborhood, instead of the man whose name was still printed on the deed. That evening, I parked my truck beneath the old oak tree beside the farmhouse and opened every property file my grandfather had ever saved. Dust floated through the fading sunlight while the familiar scent of aged paper, cedar shelves, and machine oil filled the room. Every tax receipt was there, every survey map, every maintenance invoice going back decades. Nothing mentioned an aviation agreement, an easement, or any permission for aircraft. If anything, the records proved the opposite. My grandfather documented everything because he trusted paperwork more than promises. Around sunset, my neighbor Bill Harper drove over in his dented pickup, his boots crunching across the gravel before he even reached the porch. Bill had grazed cattle on the northern pasture for almost 12 years. When I asked whether he had seen airplanes using the south field, he looked at me with genuine confusion. "I figured you leased it out," he admitted. "They have been coming and going for years." Those 7 words echoed louder than any airplane engine. For years, Bill explained that the flights usually happened on Friday afternoons and Sunday evenings. Small private aircraft, business owners, real estate investors, sometimes families arriving for community events. They landed, climbed into waiting sport utility vehicles, and disappeared through a service gate connecting directly to Falcon Ridge Estates. According to Bill, everyone treated it like a perfectly normal private landing strip. He even remembered seeing maintenance crews mowing the grass in long straight lines every few weeks. The more he described it, the more carefully organized everything sounded. This was never a spontaneous shortcut. It was an operation. The following morning, I returned to the south pasture before sunrise. Dew covered the grass, soaking my boots as I walked slowly across the field. Without the distraction of aircraft, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Reflective runway markers had been driven deep into the ground with professional precision. Solar-powered edge lights sat low enough to avoid attention from the county road, but high enough to guide approaching pilots after sunset. Fresh gravel had been spread over sections where tires regularly crossed the fence opening. Even the gate itself had been modified. Someone had quietly replaced the original chain with heavy-duty hinges designed for frequent use. I touched the cold steel and immediately recognized it was far newer than the surrounding fence. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Near the center of the field, faint white paint still clung to the grass beneath fresh growth, forming a center line almost invisible unless the morning light struck it from exactly the right angle. They had actually painted runway markings on my land. I followed the line toward the western boundary until I reached a narrow opening hidden behind rows of decorative cedar trees planted just inside the subdivision. From the neighborhood side, the trees created the illusion of privacy. From my side, they concealed vehicle traffic moving directly between the runway and Falcon Ridge Estates. Tire tracks pressed firmly into the soil told the rest of the story. Expensive vehicles had traveled this route hundreds of times. Standing there, I could smell freshly cut grass mixed with the faint odor of aviation fuel lingering in the warming air. Birds sang from the fence posts as though nothing unusual had ever happened here, yet every detail around me proved otherwise. Someone had invested thousands of dollars transforming part of my ranch into an airport facility, and they had done it carefully enough that a busy owner visiting only occasionally might never notice until the right morning arrived. Margaret had not exaggerated when she spoke about community access. She had simply left out one critical detail. Every improvement, every marker, every landing, and every dollar earned depended entirely upon land that never belonged to the homeowners association in the first place. By the end of that week, I stopped asking whether the runway existed and started asking a different question. How had something this visible managed to survive for years without anyone questioning it? As an engineer, I had learned that every project leaves a paper trail, even when people try to hide it. Permits, invoices, maintenance schedules, contractor estimates. Somebody always creates a record. I drove to the county records office carrying copies of my deed, the original property survey and photographs I had taken across the south pasture that morning. The clerk behind the counter patiently searched parcel maps, easement filings, development applications, and roadway improvements connected to Falcon Ridge Estates. After nearly 40 minutes, she turned the monitor toward me and quietly said she could not find a single recorded document granting anyone the right to build or operate an aviation facility on my property. That should have made me feel better, but it actually made the situation more confusing. If no legal authorization existed, then why had everyone behaved as though the runway belonged there? Before leaving, I asked whether the subdivision had submitted any requests involving my southern boundary. The clerk found several development revisions over the past few years, including landscaping changes, utility adjustments, and drainage improvements near the western fence, but nothing mentioning aircraft operations. Every official record stopped just short of the truth I had witnessed with my own eyes. On the drive home, I noticed another airplane circling several miles away before descending toward my ranch with the same smooth confidence as the first pilot. This time I parked beneath a line of oak trees instead of driving into the field. I simply watched. The aircraft landed, rolled to the familiar stopping point, and a black luxury sport utility vehicle arrived less than 2 minutes later through the concealed service gate. The timing was too precise to be accidental. Someone had coordinated arrivals so routinely that every driver knew exactly when to appear. I stayed out of sight until both vehicles disappeared, then walked across the runway again. Fresh tire impressions crossed the grass beside the painted center line, and I noticed faint rubber marks where aircraft wheels repeatedly touched down. The runway was not just being used. It was being maintained through constant traffic. That afternoon, I called the attorney who had handled my grandfather's estate years earlier. After reviewing the documents I emailed him, he paused for several seconds before answering. He explained that ownership was still unquestionably mine, but proving the full extent of unauthorized use would require more than photographs and personal observations. If this had been happening for years, evidence showing frequency, organization, and financial benefit would become extremely important. His advice surprised me. He told me not to rush into tearing out markers or blocking access because doing so might destroy valuable proof of how the operation actually functioned. Instead, he suggested documenting everything exactly as it existed. When I ended the call, I looked back across the quiet pasture where nothing seemed to be moving except the breeze pushing gently through the grass. Yet I could still smell the faint trace of aviation fuel lingering in the warm afternoon air, almost like the land itself was holding onto every landing that had taken place. For the first time since this strange discovery began, I realized that uncovering the truth would require patience instead of anger. Whoever had organized this operation had become comfortable because they believed nobody was paying attention. I intended to change that without letting them realize it until every piece of the puzzle finally fit together. The next several days became an exercise in paying attention to details most people would never notice. I adjusted my work schedule, stayed at the farmhouse, and quietly observed the south pasture from a distance without interfering. Every morning began the same way. Coffee on the porch before sunrise. The smell of damp earth drifting across the fields. Meadowlarks calling from the fence posts. Then, almost like clockwork, activity would begin whenever a flight was expected. A maintenance pickup appeared through the hidden gate carrying 2 workers wearing plain shirts with no company logos. They walked the length of the runway, removed fallen branches, checked the solar edge lights, and even repositioned a pair of orange cones near the approach end before driving away. They worked with the confidence of people following an established checklist instead of improvising. I photographed everything through a telephoto lens, making certain each image included recognizable landmarks from my property survey. Late that afternoon, I noticed something even more valuable. One of the workers unlocked a weatherproof utility cabinet mounted beside the concealed access road. After the truck left, curiosity finally overcame me. I waited until the area was completely quiet before walking over. The cabinet was empty except for spare reflector markers, rechargeable batteries, and a laminated inspection sheet clipped neatly to the inside door. I did not remove anything. I simply photographed every page exactly where I found it. The inspection log listed dates stretching back nearly 4 years, with handwritten initials beside routine maintenance tasks, including runway lights, surface mowing, windsock inspection, and marker replacement. Whoever organized this operation had documented its own existence. As I carefully closed the cabinet, I noticed a small metal tag screwed to the inside frame bearing the name of a local landscaping contractor. That single detail gave me another thread to follow. The following morning, I visited the contractor's office under the simple pretense of requesting an estimate for brush clearing on my ranch. While waiting in the reception area, I recognized framed photographs showing completed commercial projects around the county. One image immediately caught my attention. In the background of a ribbon-cutting ceremony stood the exact same maintenance truck I had photographed near my pasture. Another picture displayed employees installing solar pathway lights that looked identical to the fixtures hidden along my field. I thanked the receptionist for her time, collected a business card, and left without asking the questions I really wanted answered. There was still no reason to alert anyone that I understood how much evidence had already accumulated. That evening, I returned to the farmhouse and searched through another stack of my grandfather's old filing boxes stored beneath a workbench in the barn. Tucked inside a faded envelope was an aerial survey commissioned nearly 20 years earlier for agricultural drainage planning. Folded behind the map sat a letter from the licensed surveyor explaining that permanent boundary monuments had been installed at every critical corner of the property because future development nearby could create ownership disputes. I smiled despite everything that had happened. My grandfather had anticipated problems long before Falcon Ridge Estates existed. He had simply prepared for them in the quiet, methodical way he approached everything else. As the sun disappeared beyond the western tree line, I walked to one of the original survey monuments still standing exactly where the letter said it would be. I brushed away the dirt with my boot and uncovered the stamped metal cap marking the true property line. The hidden runway crossed directly over it. At that moment, I understood that the strongest evidence was not something I needed to create. It had been waiting beneath the grass all along, patiently outlasting every unauthorized landing that had passed above it. Once I understood that the evidence already existed, I stopped chasing answers and started building a timeline. Every photograph I had taken was organized by date, time, and location. Every aircraft arrival was matched with weather conditions, visible tail numbers whenever possible, and the exact minute each sport utility vehicle entered through the concealed gate. My engineering background had taught me that facts become far more persuasive when they tell a complete story instead of existing as isolated moments. Within a week, my dining room table had disappeared beneath aerial photographs, survey maps, property records, handwritten notes, and printed satellite images stretching back several years. Patterns began appearing that I had completely missed at first. Aircraft almost always arrived before major neighborhood events, board meetings, charity fundraisers, or weekends when expensive homes were being shown to prospective buyers. Convenience was not the real purpose. The runway had quietly become part of Falcon Ridge Estate's image. It projected exclusivity. It made the community seem more desirable. My property had been transformed into an unadvertised feature that helped increase the appeal of homes I did not own. That realization explained why everyone had acted so confidently. They had convinced themselves the benefit outweighed the question of ownership. My attorney reviewed the growing collection of documents and smiled for the first time since I had contacted him. He told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing. Do not interfere. Do not argue with anyone. Let the facts continue speaking. He also recommended hiring an independent licensed surveyor to verify every boundary marker before anyone else had an opportunity to challenge the original property lines. 2 days later, the survey crew arrived just after sunrise wearing bright safety vests and carrying precision global positioning system equipment. They worked methodically across the pasture, locating every monument described in my grandfather's records. Standing beside them while the receivers quietly collected satellite data, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. Mathematics did not care about opinions. Coordinates did not recognize neighborhood assumptions. Property lines remained exactly where they had always been. By late afternoon, the lead surveyor handed me a preliminary field sketch showing the hidden runway crossing well inside my southern acreage. There was no ambiguity. The measurements matched the original survey completed decades earlier within inches. That evening, another airplane approached from the southwest. Instead of feeling surprised, I quietly noted the arrival time in my notebook while photographing the landing from the same position I had used all week. A luxury vehicle appeared through the concealed gate exactly 1 minute and 43 seconds after the aircraft stopped rolling. Even their routine had become predictable. Before leaving, the passengers gathered briefly beside the airplane, laughing over coffee cups while one of them pointed toward the neighborhood clubhouse in the distance. None of them appeared to realize they had become part of a carefully documented record. As the aircraft climbed back into the clear evening sky, I noticed the runway lights beginning to glow against the fading daylight, one after another, exactly as they had every weekend for years. Their quiet rhythm no longer represented mystery. It represented consistency, and consistency is one of the strongest forms of evidence. I stood beside the original boundary monument my grandfather had protected so carefully, listening to crickets replace the sound of the departing engine, and I realized the most difficult part of this entire situation was already behind me. I no longer needed to prove that something unusual had happened on my land. I only needed to demonstrate, with patience and precision, exactly how long it had been happening and exactly who had chosen to treat my family's property as though it belonged to someone else. Everything came together on the first Saturday of the following month. The neighborhood was hosting one of its largest annual events, and based on every pattern I had documented, I knew aircraft traffic would be heavier than usual. Before sunrise, the survey crew had already completed their certified drawings. My attorney had organized every deed, boundary record, aerial photograph, maintenance log, and dated image into a single indexed binder. Copies had been delivered to the appropriate county offices along with a formal request for review. I was not interested in creating a dramatic confrontation. I wanted every decision to come from verified facts instead of raised voices. By mid-morning, I stood near the old oak tree watching another airplane appear over the horizon. The engine sounded just like it had on the morning this entire story began, steady and familiar, but this time I understood exactly what I was hearing. The aircraft descended, rolled smoothly across the trimmed grass, and stopped beside the windsock that had never belonged there. Within moments, the familiar black sport utility vehicle emerged through the concealed gate, but it was not alone. A county survey vehicle arrived from the opposite direction, followed by another truck carrying officials who had been reviewing the documentation throughout the week. They stepped out quietly, carrying measuring equipment and copies of the certified survey. Nobody rushed. Nobody argued. The lead surveyor walked directly to the original boundary monument my grandfather had protected decades earlier and verified its coordinates in front of everyone present. From there he measured the distance to the painted center line, the edge markers, the concealed access road, and the runway lights. Every measurement confirmed the same conclusion. The entire landing area extended across privately owned property without any recorded authorization. Margaret Holloway arrived several minutes later wearing the same calm expression she had shown me at the clubhouse, but this time she spent more time looking at the survey maps than at the people holding them. She pointed toward the landscaped entrance of Falcon Ridge Estates, as though the surrounding improvements somehow explained everything. The certified documents did not change. The property lines remained exactly where they had always been. One by one, the details that had once seemed insignificant suddenly carried enormous weight. The faded white paint beneath the grass, the inspection sheet inside the maintenance cabinet, the solar lights hidden behind mesquite bushes, the carefully trimmed runway, the photographs hanging inside the clubhouse. Even the timing of the arriving vehicles matched the records I had quietly assembled over several weeks. Each individual piece might have been dismissed on its own, but together they described a complete system that had operated with remarkable consistency. Standing beside the pasture, I noticed the pilot studying the survey stakes with visible confusion before speaking privately with the officials. No one appeared angry. Most simply looked surprised to learn the runway had never been established on property controlled by the community at all. As the afternoon sun settled over the ranch, the sounds that filled the air were no longer aircraft engines or arriving vehicles, but measuring instruments, quiet conversations, and pages turning inside thick binders of evidence. I looked across the same field where I had once believed I was witnessing an impossible situation and realized something my grandfather had understood long before I inherited this land. Patience does not slow down the truth. It gives the truth enough time to become impossible for anyone to ignore. Over the following weeks, the quiet routine that had defined my ranch slowly returned, but not before the facts completed the work that emotion never could have accomplished. The certified survey, historical property records, maintenance photographs, inspection logs, and documented flight activity painted one clear picture. The improvements across my pasture had never been supported by any recorded agreement with my family, and once every document had been reviewed together, the unauthorized operation came to an end. One by one, the temporary features disappeared. The orange cones were collected. The reflector markers were removed. The concealed access route through the cedar trees was closed. The solar runway lights that had glowed across my field every weekend were carefully taken away until the pasture looked the way my grandfather had always intended. For the first time in years, the evening breeze crossed uninterrupted grass instead of painted lines and hidden equipment. I walked the property almost every morning after that, carrying the same weathered notebook my grandfather had carried decades earlier. Instead of documenting mysterious tire tracks or unfamiliar aircraft, I found fresh wildflowers returning to the southern pasture. The meadow had already begun reclaiming the narrow strips where airplanes had landed so many times. Nature had a remarkable way of restoring itself once people finally stepped aside. Bill Harper smiled the first time he drove past without seeing a waiting sport utility vehicle near the fence. He joked that the loudest thing on the ranch was once again his cattle asking for breakfast. Even the air smelled different. The lingering scent of aviation fuel had disappeared, replaced by fresh-cut hay, cedar, and warm Texas soil after an early spring rain. Several months later, I stopped by the county office to pick up certified copies of updated survey records for my files. The clerk recognized my name immediately and quietly thanked me for keeping such detailed documentation. She told me that careful records often solve disputes far more effectively than arguments ever could. I smiled because those words sounded exactly like something my grandfather would have said. Before leaving, I drove past Falcon Ridge Estates one final time. The entrance still looked polished, the fountains still sparkled, and families still enjoyed the neighborhood they had chosen. Life continued, just as it should. The only difference was that the hidden shortcut through my ranch no longer existed. Property boundaries once again matched reality instead of assumption. As I turned back toward home, I looked across the southern pasture where this entire journey had begun. The windsock was gone. The painted centerline had faded beneath new growth. The old boundary monument remained exactly where it had stood for decades, quiet and unmoving, patiently marking the truth through every season. That simple metal marker had outlasted every temporary improvement built around it. Looking back, I realized the most important lesson had nothing to do with airplanes or expensive neighborhoods. It was about stewardship. My grandfather had protected this land with patience, records, and respect because he understood that ownership was more than a name on a deed. It was a responsibility carried forward one generation at a time. Standing beneath the old oak tree as the evening sun settled over 220 acres of peaceful grass, I listened carefully. There were no engines overhead, no vehicles waiting beyond the cedar trees, and no unfamiliar voices crossing my fence line. There was only the sound I had always believed belonged here from the very beginning, the steady whisper of the Texas wind moving across land that finally felt like home again.